The edict that brought her to the Night King's court had promised a life's work, a challenge worthy of her particular genius. Elara, whose hands could read the memory of vellum and whose eyes saw the ghosts of faded ink, was to be the restorer of the Lyceum of Shadows, the legendary library of King Valerus. It was an honor that tasted of terror. She had traveled for 6 weeks, moving from the sun-drenched southern provinces into the perpetual twilight of the Mountain Kingdom, a land of black pines that clawed at a bruised purple sky. The carriage, lacquered black and drawn by horses that breathed mist into the cold air, finally passed through gates of wrought iron that seemed to have grown from the very bones of the mountain. The obsidian keep did not rise so much as it clung to the peak, a spill of ink-dark stone and glittering quartz against the clouds. She was left in a vast, cold hall where her breath plumed before her, the only sound the distant, mournful cry of the wind through high battlements. Tapestries thick with dust and ages depicted forgotten battles, the silver thread of their stitching catching the faint light from impossibly high windows. She clutched the satchel containing her tools, brushes of badger hair, powdered pigments in clamshells, knives of sharpened obsidian as if it were a shield. She felt small here, a fleeting mote of warm dust in a monument of eternal ice. Her heart hammered a frantic, human rhythm against her ribs, a sound she was certain must be deafening in the profound silence. This was a place built to awe, to intimidate, to remind any mortal of their fragile, transient nature. It was succeeding. When he finally appeared, it was not with the clang of armor or the fanfare of a court, but as a deeper shadow detaching itself from the gloom at the far end of the hall. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly soundless, a predator's economy of motion that was more unnerving than any overt display of power. King Valerus was nothing like the monstrous caricatures from the stories told in the south. He was tall and starkly elegant, dressed in black silks that seemed to drink the light. His face was a masterpiece of cruel angles and ancient sorrow, his skin the color of old marble. But it was his eyes that held her, that stopped the breath in her lungs. They were the color of twilight, a deep, luminous violet, and they held the crushing weight of centuries. They saw not just a young woman in a cold hall, but the entire, fragile arc of her life, from its beginning to its inevitable, pathetic end. "You are the cartographer," he said. His voice was not a boom or a hiss, but a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the stones, in the very air she breathed. It was like the lowest note of a cello, a sound of immense and patient gravity. Elara found she could not speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with a fear so pure it was almost sublime. She felt utterly transparent, as if he could see the frantic, terrified bird of her soul beating itself against the cage of her bones. He glided closer, stopping a few feet from her. The air grew colder, charged with a presence that felt like a storm front moving in. He did not look at her tools, or her travel-worn clothes. He looked only at her hands, which she still had clasped around her satchel. They were stained with ink and lye, the nails short and practical. A cartographer's hands. A worker's hands. "They say you can make ghosts speak," he murmured, his gaze lifting to finally meet hers again. "That you can read the tales left in paper and dust. I listen to what the materials have to say, Your Majesty," she managed, her voice a thin, reedy thing. The stress of the fibers, the composition of the ink, the memory of the fold. "They tell a story," she surprised herself. The words, a simple truth of her craft, came out steady, a small island of certainty in an ocean of fear. A flicker of something, not quite surprise, not quite amusement, passed through his ageless eyes. It was a subtle shift, a momentary disturbance in the deep, still waters of his composure. He tilted his head, a gesture of genuine curiosity that was jarringly human. "The memory of the fold," he repeated softly, as if tasting the words. "And what do you suppose the memory of this place would tell you, Elara of Oakhaven?" The use of her name, of her home, was a small, sharp shock. It made her feel seen, not as a tool summoned to perform a task, but as a person. The fear did not vanish, but something else bloomed beside it, a spark of defiance, a need to be more than the trembling creature he saw. "That it is lonely, Your Majesty," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And very, very old." The silence that followed was absolute. She was certain she had made a fatal error, that her impertinence would be met with a flash of regal fury. She braced herself, her knuckles white on her satchel. But Valerus did not move. He simply watched her, his violet eyes holding an expression she could not begin to decipher. It was not anger. It was something deeper, more complex, a profound, aching recognition. For the first time, she saw past the king, past the ancient predator, and glimpsed the prisoner within the fortress of his own immortality. He was the ghost in his own palace. After a long, suspended moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The Lyceum is this way," he said, his voice softer now, the resonant edge smoothed away. "Come. Show me what stories you can find." He turned and began to walk, the darkness seeming to part for him and close behind him, and after a heartbeat of stunned hesitation, Ilara followed him into the heart of the shadow. The Lyceum of Shadows was a cathedral to forgotten knowledge. 3 circular tiers of shelves carved from black-veined marble rose into a domed ceiling where a single, vast oculus opened to the perpetually overcast sky. The light that filtered down was pale and diffuse, a silver dust that illuminated floating motes and the shimmer of ancient magic that clung to the place like a second skin. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and something else, a clean, cold scent like stone after a winter rain. For Ilara, it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. It was a graveyard of stories, and she was its chosen necromancer. Valerus left her there with a single instruction: begin, and so she did. The first week was a blur of assessment. She moved through the aisles with a reverence that bordered on worship, her fingers ghosting over spines of cracked leather and bindings of flaking wood. She catalogued the damage, the slow creep of mold, the silverfish trails like miniature, destructive highways, the water stains that bloomed like pale continents on priceless celestial charts. She set up her work table in the center of the main floor, directly under the oculus, arranging her tools with the meticulous care of a surgeon. The silence was her companion, broken only by the whisper of her own movements and the faint, ever-present sigh of the wind outside. She felt the weight of the king's observation even when he was not there, a subtle pressure at the edge of her awareness. She was a curiosity, a fragile, ticking clock introduced into a place that had forgotten time. He began to visit in the second week. He would appear as he had in the great hall, a silent manifestation at the edge of the room, and simply watch her work. He never announced himself, but she always knew. The air would shift, growing denser, colder. At first, she would flinch, her hand jerking as she applied a poultice of rice flour to a brittle page. But his stillness was absolute, and slowly, she grew accustomed to his presence. She learned to continue her work, her movements precise and economical under his ageless gaze. They existed in these shared silences for days, a silent king and a silent craftsman, the only communication the soft scratch of her brush against paper. Then, one evening, as she was painstakingly re-inking the constellations on a star chart from the Second Age, he spoke. "That star is gone now," he said, his voice a low vibration from the shadows behind her. Ilara startled, dropping her brush. A single bead of black ink fell, landing perilously close to a depiction of a dragon. With a gasp, she blotted it carefully with a scrap of cotton, her heart pounding. She turned to face him. He had moved closer than ever before, standing just on the other side of her massive work table. The pale light from the oculus sculpted his face, leaving his eyes in deep shadow. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. You startled me." "That star," he repeated, gesturing with a long, elegant finger toward the chart. "It collapsed into itself 900 years ago. It was loud." She stared at him, at the casual way he spoke of a 900-year-old memory. "You saw it." "I saw the light of its dying," he corrected softly. "A new, temporary sun in the winter sky. For 3 nights, there were no shadows in my kingdom." He looked away from the chart and at her, and the sense of his immense age washed over her. He was a living library, a witness to the slow, inexorable turning of the cosmos. "It must be strange," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "to remember things that the world has forgotten." "It is a burden," he said, and there was no self-pity in his tone, only a statement of fact as simple and solid as the stone beneath their feet. "Memories accumulate. They become a weight. Most of my court, they choose to forget. They let the centuries blur. It is a mercy. But you don't," she stated, not a question. A king cannot afford mercy. Not for his enemies, and not for himself. He looked back at the chart, at her careful work. You are restoring a memory the paper has forgotten. Perhaps you understand. It was the first bridge between them, a fragile span of words across an abyss of time and nature. From then on, his visits changed. He would still appear in silence, but he would speak, asking her about her work. He wanted to know the why of it, not just the how. Why this pigment, why that stitch? He would listen, his violet eyes fixed on her, as she explained the delicate chemistry of restoration. In return, he would offer fragments of the past. He'd point to a map of a coastline. This was all forest, once. I hunted there as a young man. He never said as a mortal man, but the words hung in the air between them. She learned to read the nuances of his silences, the slight narrowing of his eyes that signaled a painful memory, the almost imperceptible softening of his mouth when she described something with particular passion. One afternoon, she was working on a small, unassuming book of poetry. The binding was gone, the pages loose and fragile. As she carefully separated them, she saw it was a collection of love poems, simple and achingly human. He was there, watching her, a sentinel in the gloom. They are clumsy, he said, his voice quiet. I think they're beautiful, she countered, her fingers tracing a line of faded script. Your eyes are the summer sky after a storm. They're honest. Honesty is a luxury of the short-lived, he said, a familiar note of cynicism in his voice. Is it? She asked, looking up at him. Or is it the only thing that lasts? The stone of this castle will crumble. The stars you remember will die. But the feeling that made a person write this, that's a kind of eternity, isn't it? She held up the fragile page, a small testament to a long-dead heart. Valerus was silent for a long time. He moved around the table until he stood beside her, looking down at the poem. His proximity was overwhelming, a physical presence that hummed against her skin. She could feel the chill radiating from him, a stark contrast to the warmth of her own living body. He reached out, his long, pale fingers hovering over the page, not quite touching it, as if he feared his very touch would turn it to dust. His hand was a breath away from hers. She could see the faint, translucent quality of his skin, the blue of the dormant veins beneath. Her own hand trembled slightly. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the impossible gulf between them and the strange, terrifying magnetism that was beginning to pull them across it. He slowly lowered his hand, his gaze lifting from the poem to her face. In his eyes, for a fleeting, breathtaking moment, she saw not a king or a predator, but a man drowning in an ocean of time, staring at a single, distant light. The King's Council met in the Chamber of Echoes, a circular room directly beneath the throne room, where whispers were said to linger for hours. Lord Cassian stood before the obsidian table, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of dignified concern. He was older than most, his hair the color of polished silver, his face a web of fine lines that spoke not of age, but of sustained, patient thought. He was the king's oldest advisor, the keeper of traditions, the anchor that held the ancient and volatile vampire court to its moorings. And he saw the human woman as a rogue wave threatening to tear them loose. He spends hours with her, Cassian said, his voice calm, reasonable. Alone. In the library. He speaks to her of the past. Things he has not spoken of to any of us in centuries. Lord Marius, a younger, more impetuous vampire with a taste for cruelty, sneered. He is indulging a fancy. The creature is comely, for a mortal. He will tire of her as he tires of all his pets. This is not the same, Cassian countered, his voice sharp enough to cut through Marius's dismissive tone. I have served him for a millennium. I have never seen him like this. She is not a pet. He looks at her and sees something else. A reflection. A memory of what he once was. It is a weakness, a sickness of the soul, and it is making him careless. He let his words hang in the silent, cold air. He knew the members of this council. He knew their fears, their ambitions. He knew that the one thing they feared more than an outside enemy was a change in the king, a disruption to the perfect, static order of their existence. What would you have us do? Lady Morwenna asked, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She was ancient, her skin stretched thin over her bones, her eyes dark pits of weary cynicism. He is the king. His fancies are his own. A king's fancies become the kingdom's vulnerabilities, Cassian said smoothly. The human kingdoms to the south grow bold. They test our borders. They send spies. And we have a human, a clever one, nestled in the very heart of our keep, whispering in our sovereign's ear. Are we to do nothing? To simply trust in her, innocence? He let the word innocence drip with scorn. He had their attention. He could feel it, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. He had planted the seed. Now, he only had to water it. Days later, the moment Cassian had been waiting for arrived. It was small, almost insignificant, but in the charged atmosphere of the court, it was enough. Ilara had been working late, restoring a series of borderland maps that had been damaged by moisture. Valerus found her there, her shoulders slumped with fatigue, a smudge of pigment on her cheek. The vast library was dark, save for the single lamp on her table, a small pool of golden light in an ocean of shadow. You should rest, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Almost done, she murmured, not looking up. She was trying to replicate the precise shade of umber used by the original cartographer. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. She felt him move closer, the familiar chill of his presence washing over her. Your hands, he said quietly. She stopped, looking down at them. They were covered in ink, pigment, and the fine dust of scraped vellum. They were trembling slightly from hours of meticulous work. They are never still. A cartographer's curse, she said with a weary smile, finally looking up at him. He was standing so close, his shadow falling over her table. The intimacy of the moment, alone in the vast, silent dark, was both terrifying and exhilarating. There is always another line to draw, another coast to map. He reached out, and this time, he did not hesitate. He gently took her right hand, turning it over in his. His touch was cold, a shock against her warm skin, but it was not unpleasant. It was like being touched by living marble. He studied her hand, his thumb tracing the ink-stained calluses on her fingertips. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. It was a king, an ancient and terrible being, touching her not with power or possession, but with a quiet, searching tenderness. You carry your work on your skin, he whispered, his violet eyes lifting to meet hers. In their depths, she saw a universe of loneliness, a longing so profound it stole her breath. She could not speak. She could only stare back at him, her heart a frantic drum against the silence. In that moment, the chasm between them vanished. There was no king, no human, only two isolated souls finding a flicker of recognition in the dark. He held her hand for a long moment, the contact a silent conversation that said more than words ever could. Then, slowly, as if it cost him a great deal, he released her and stepped back into the shadows, melting away and leaving her alone with the echo of his touch and the wild, impossible beating of her own heart. Cassian had watched from the highest balcony, a sliver of a shadow among shadows. He had seen it all, the soft light, the quiet words, the touch. He had seen the look on the king's face. It was not the look of a master for a pet. It was the look of a man for a woman. A look of unguarded, ruinous vulnerability. He turned away, his face set like stone. The sickness was worse than he had feared. It had to be cut out, before the infection spread and brought them all to ruin. His plan, once a nebulous concept, now solidified into sharp, lethal certainty. He would not fail. He would save the king from himself. The first blow was struck not with a sword, but with a folded piece of paper. Cassian requested a private audience with the king, a matter of grave urgency. They met in Valerus's private study, a room panelled in dark, polished wood that smelled of beeswax and old secrets. A fire crackled in the hearth, its light glinting off the silver inlay of the king's desk. Valerus stood by the window, looking out at the jagged peaks that tore at the belly of the sky. He had been restless since his encounter with Ilara in the library, the memory of her warm skin against his cold hand a persistent, unsettling ember in the frozen landscape of his existence. You said it was urgent, Cassian, Valerus said without turning. His voice was flat, betraying nothing of his internal turmoil. It is, my king. Cassian stepped forward, his expression a careful study in somber duty. He placed the folded paper on the edge of the desk. This was found in the human's quarters. During a routine sweep. My apologies for the intrusion, but security protocols must be observed. Valerus turned slowly. His eyes, those deep violet pools, narrowed slightly as they fell upon the letter. He did not move to pick it up. The human has a name. Ilara. And her quarters are not to be searched without my direct order. A lapse in communication, sire. It will not happen again, Cassian said smoothly, though they both knew no such order had been given. But I felt you must see this. It was hidden within the lining of a travel cloak. With a heavy sense of foreboding, Valerus moved to the desk. He picked up the paper. It was cheap stock, common in the southern kingdoms. The seal had been broken. He unfolded it. The script was small and precise, written in a brown ink he recognized as being made from oak galls, a human concoction. It was a letter, addressed to E. It spoke of their contact being in place, of the cartographer's project providing excellent cover, of waiting for a signal to illuminate the heart of the shadow. It was signed with a simple sigil, a hawk in flight. The symbol of Baron Valeric, a notoriously ambitious and aggressive human nobleman whose lands bordered their own. Valerus read it twice. The words were poison, seeping into the cracks of a paranoia honed over 2,000 years of betrayals and assassination attempts. His first instinct was a violent, absolute rejection. It was impossible. The woman whose hand he had held, whose earnest passion for her craft was so pure, could not be this. A spy. A common, treacherous little snake. But the evidence was there, in his hand. The hawk sigil. The mention of a cartographer. The chilling phrase, illuminate the heart of the shadow. It is a forgery, he said, his voice a low growl. He was trying to convince himself as much as Cassian. Perhaps, Cassian conceded, his tone maddeningly reasonable. It is crude. But spies often use such methods to avoid suspicion. A finely crafted letter would draw attention. This feels authentic in its very plainness. And the information within, it is too specific to be a coincidence. He paused, letting the silence stretch. She has access to the Lyceum, sire. To maps of our defenses, our troop movements, our secret passages. To the very heart of this keep. Valerus crushed the paper in his fist. The sound was like a dry leaf crumbling. He felt a cold fury, but he was unsure of its target. Was it at this Baron Valeric, for his audacity? At Cassian, for bringing this filth to him? Or at Ilara, for potentially making him a fool? He thought of her face, illuminated by the lamplight. He thought of her voice, explaining the beauty of clumsy, honest poems. It couldn't be true. But doubt was a seed. Once planted in the fertile soil of a king's mind, it was nearly impossible to uproot. I will handle this, Valerus said, his voice like chipping ice. Leave me. Cassian bowed, a perfect, deferential arc of his spine. As you command, my king. He backed out of the room, leaving Valerus alone with the fire and the poison he had just administered. Valerus stood for a long time, the crumpled letter a knot of heat in his cold hand. He wanted to burn it, to pretend it never existed. But he could not. He was a king before he was a man. Duty was the cage that had shaped him. He uncurled his fingers and smoothed the letter out on his desk, his eyes tracing the treacherous words again. Illuminate the heart of the shadow. Later that evening, he went to the library. He told himself it was to observe, to look for a sign, a tell. He found her at her table, her head bent over a large, complex map of the Western Territories. She was humming softly to herself, a simple, meandering tune. She looked up as he approached, and a smile touched her lips, a genuine, unguarded thing that lit her face. Your Majesty, she said, her eyes bright. Look. I believe I've found an error in the original survey. See this river? The tributaries are drawn incorrectly. It means the pass it flows from must be wider than we thought. He looked where she pointed, but he didn't see the river. He saw a spy, offering up a piece of intelligence as a show of good faith. He saw a trick. The smile on her face now seemed like a mask. Her earnestness felt like a performance. The poison was working. Is that so? He said, his voice flat and cold. He did not move closer. He stood several feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, a posture of judgment. The light in her eyes dimmed. Her smile faltered. She felt the change instantly, the sudden glacier that had descended between them. The warmth from their last encounter was gone, replaced by a polar chill. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice small. "The security of this kingdom is my primary concern," he said, the words formal, distant. "Your work brings you into contact with sensitive materials. A certain vigilance is required." Her face paled. She looked down at her hands, then back at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Vigilance? Have I done something to displease you?" He looked at her, at the genuine bewilderment in her eyes, and for a moment, his resolve wavered. He wanted to stride across the space between them, to tell her about the letter, to hear her deny it, to believe her. But the king in him held the man in check. To reveal the source of his suspicion would be to show his hand. It was a tactical error. And so he held his ground, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "See that your work is concluded in a timely manner," he said, his tone clipped and final. "You will be given a new set of guards. They will escort you to and from your quarters. For your protection." He turned and left before she could respond, the sound of his footsteps unnaturally loud in the vast, silent library. Ilara stood frozen, staring at the space where he had been. "For your protection." The words echoed in the air, a cold, cruel irony. She felt as if a wall of ice had just slammed down around her. She was no longer a guest, no longer a valued artisan. She was a prisoner. She looked down at the map, at the river she had been so proud to correct, and the lines blurred through the sudden, hot tears that filled her eyes. The change was immediate and absolute. The next morning, 2 guards stood outside her door, their faces as blank and impassive as their steel helmets. They did not speak to her. They flanked her as she walked to the Lyceum, their steps a heavy, rhythmic counterpoint to her own light tread. They stood at the entrance to the library all day, their presence a constant, suffocating weight. The other members of the court, who had previously regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, now looked away as she passed, their expressions shuttered. She was marked. The library, once her sanctuary, became a gilded cage. The silence that had once been peaceful now felt accusatory. Every rustle of paper, every clink of a tool on her table, seemed to echo in the cavernous space. She tried to lose herself in her work, to focus on the familiar comfort of her craft, but the joy was gone. Her hands felt clumsy, her focus shattered. She felt watched, not just by the guards at the door, but by the very shadows in the corners of the room. Valerus did not return. The emptiness he left behind was a palpable thing, a cold ache in the center of the room where he used to stand. She felt a desperate need to understand. What had she done? What had changed? The abruptness of his withdrawal was a wound. One evening he was holding her hand, his eyes filled with a silent, aching question, and the next he was a stranger, a cold king looking at her as if she were a line of text in a long-forgotten law book. The whiplash of it left her dizzy and heartsick. Loneliness, which had been a quiet companion, now became a crushing presence. She was an alien creature in a world of stone and shadow, and the one person who had made her feel seen had now cast her back into the darkness. After 3 days of this silent torment, she couldn't bear it any longer. She had to speak to him. She had to know why. That evening, when the guards came to escort her back to her room, she stopped. "I need to see the king," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The guard on the right, a grim-faced vampire with a scar that bisected his eyebrow, didn't even look at her. "The king is not receiving visitors. Please," she insisted, stepping toward him. "It's important. There has been a misunderstanding. Our orders are to escort you to your quarters," the other guard said, his voice flat. He took a half-step forward, a subtle, menacing gesture. Desperation made her bold. "I will not move from this spot until you take me to him, or he comes to me." She stood her ground, her small form defiant between the 2 towering figures. For a moment, she thought they might take her by force. The air crackled with tension. Then, the scarred guard seemed to reconsider. Perhaps the idea of a scene was more trouble than it was worth. He exchanged a look with his partner, then gave a curt nod. Wait here. He turned and disappeared into the shadowed corridors, his footsteps receding into silence. Ilara waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was alone with the remaining guard, who stared straight ahead, a statue of disapproval. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She rehearsed what she would say, the words jumbling in her mind. What have I done? Why have you turned from me? Let me explain. But what was there to explain? She didn't even know the nature of her crime. Finally, she heard footsteps returning. But it was not the guard. It was Valeru's. He stopped at the entrance of the Lyceum, framed by the grand archway. The guards who had been posted there melted back into the shadows. He looked regal and remote, a figure from a legend, not the man who had marveled at her ink-stained hands. You wished to see me, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she breathed, taking a step toward him. Your Majesty, I don't understand. The guards, the way everyone looks at me. If I have given offense, I beg you to tell me what it was. I will do anything to make it right. He did not move closer. He remained at the edge of her world, just beyond the reach of her lamplight. Your only offense is being what you are, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. My council has concerns. Your presence here is a complication. A complication? The word was a small, cold stone in her gut. Days ago, you told me my work had value. You spoke to me of stars. You held my hand. The last words were a whisper, a desperate, foolish admission. A flicker of something, pain, regret, crossed his face, so quick she thought she might have imagined it. But his voice, when he spoke again, was harder than before. I am a king. I have duties that supersede personal sentiment. The safety of my people is paramount. Your proximity to state secrets requires certain precautions. That is all. It was a dismissal. A cold, political explanation for a deeply personal wound. He was erasing what had passed between them, reducing it to a matter of statecraft. The injustice of it burned. Precautions? Or a prison? She challenged, her voice rising with a grief that was turning to anger. You look at me as if I am a traitor. If you believe I have done something wrong, then tell me, accuse me. Don't hide behind your crown and your guards and leave me to suffocate in silence. Silence is a kindness you should learn to appreciate, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Do not presume to understand my position, girl. You see a sliver of the world through the keyhole of your short life and think you know the shape of the room. You know nothing of the burdens I carry, or the price of my trust. The word girl struck her like a slap. It was meant to diminish her, to put her back in her place. She flinched, the fight draining out of her. She saw then that it was useless. The man was gone. Only the king remained, and the king had already judged her. I see, she said, her voice hollow. She looked down, unable to bear the coldness in his eyes. Then I will trouble you no further, Your Majesty. She turned away from him, back toward the lonely circle of light cast by her lamp. She felt his gaze on her back for a long moment, a heavy, suffocating pressure. Then, with a sound that might have been the whisper of silk or a sigh of regret, he was gone. Ilara sank into her chair, the vast, silent darkness of the library pressing in on her from all sides. The wall between them was no longer ice. It was stone, as high and as cold as the walls of the keep itself. The council convened 2 weeks later. The mood was grim, expectant. Lord Cassian had spent the intervening time meticulously building his case, weaving a tapestry of lies so detailed and convincing that even he sometimes had to admire his own artistry. He had intercepted one of Ilara's supply requests, a list of rare pigments and oils needed for her restoration work, and, with the help of his forger, had embedded a coded message within the chemical formulas. A message that, when decoded using a cipher known to be favored by Baron Valeric's spies, detailed the precise locations of the weak points in the Obsidian Keep's lower-level defenses. It was a masterpiece of malevolent craft. To complete the picture, he had arranged for the capture of a human scout near the border. The poor man was not a spy, but a fur trapper who had wandered too far. Under duress that Cassian supervised from the shadows, the trapper confessed to everything he was told to. He confirmed he was a runner for a spy known only as the cartographer, and that he was to receive a map from her, hidden within a book of southern poetry. Now, all the pieces were in place. Cassian stood before the king and the assembled council in the Chamber of Echoes. The final pieces of evidence were laid out on the polished obsidian table: the doctored supply request, the trapper's signed confession, and the small, unassuming book of love poems from Ilara's work table, which Cassian had personally retrieved from the Lyceum in the dead of night. Valerus sat at the head of the table, his face a study in granite stillness. For 2 weeks, he had been tormented. He had avoided the library, avoided the sight of her, but he could not escape the memory of her face, the hurt and confusion in her eyes. He had reread the first letter 100 times, searching for a flaw, for a reason to disbelieve it. He had found none. His logical mind, the mind of a 2,000-year-old strategist, told him the threat was real. But another part of him, a part he thought had died centuries ago, rebelled. It was a war within himself, and it was tearing him apart. "Present your findings," Valerus commanded, his voice resonating in the cold, still air. Cassian bowed. "My king, my lords. What we feared has come to pass. The human, Ilara, is not what she seems," he began, his voice calm and measured, laying out the narrative he had so carefully constructed. He spoke of the initial suspicions, the first letter. Then he moved to the new evidence. "We have decoded the cartographer's latest supply request," he pushed the vellum sheet forward. "Within the descriptions of her materials, she has hidden the coordinates of the cistern access tunnels and the old quarry gate. Information that would allow an invading force to bypass our primary defenses entirely." A low murmur went through the council. Valerus stared at the document, at the familiar list of pigments: lapis lazuli, red ochre, bone white, now twisted into a message of betrayal. "Furthermore," Cassian continued, his voice gaining strength, "we apprehended one of her contacts 3 days ago." He slid the confession across the table. "He has admitted, under questioning, to being a courier for Baron Valeric, sent to retrieve a finalized map from the spy. A map she was to hide in this." He placed his hand on the book of poetry. The same book Ilara had shown him, the one she had called beautiful and honest. The sight of it was a physical blow. He remembered her words: "That's a kind of eternity, isn't it?" Had it all been a lie? Had that moment of connection been nothing more than a spy's calculated seduction? The thought was a shard of ice in his heart. "He confessed?" Valerus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "He was forthcoming," Cassian said, a slight, cruel smile touching his lips. "He confirmed the signal she was waiting for. The phrase 'illuminate the heart of the shadow,' which we saw in the first letter. It was the command to pass the finished intelligence. It was perfect. Too perfect." A small, desperate part of Valerus's mind screamed that it was a trap, a construction. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the faces of his council were unified in their grim certainty. Marius, Morwenna, the others, they had served him for centuries. Their loyalty was proven. They were his people, his kind. She was other. A brief, warm flicker in an eternity of cold duty. To trust her over them, over the tangible proof before him, would be an act of sentimental madness. It would be an abdication of his kingship. He looked at Cassian, his oldest advisor, the one who had stood by him through wars and rebellions. Cassian met his gaze, his own eyes clear and steady, filled with what looked like sincere, grave concern. He was the anchor. He was tradition. He was security. And Ilara? She was a poem. A dying star. A memory of a life he could never have. The war inside him ended. The man, with his foolish, nascent hopes, fell silent. The king remained. His duty was clear. The safety of his kingdom, his people, demanded it. The personal cost was irrelevant. He had paid such costs before. This was just one more. He rose to his feet, the motion fluid and final. The council fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. He looked down at the book of poetry on the table, the small, fragile testament to a love he now believed was a lie. A cold, dead calm settled over him. "Bring her to the throne room," he commanded. The words were stones dropping into a deep, frozen well. "The time has come for judgment." The throne room was a cavern of intimidating grandeur, designed to make mortals feel like insects. The ceiling soared into darkness, and the walls were hung with banners depicting the long and bloody history of his reign. The throne itself was carved from a single, massive piece of obsidian, polished to a mirror shine, cold and unforgiving. Valerus sat upon it, not as the man who had walked the quiet aisles of the library, but as the embodiment of 2 millennia of absolute power. He had draped himself in the full weight of his kingship, a mantle of ice and shadow. His council stood arrayed on the steps below him, a silent chorus of judgment. When they brought Alara in, she looked impossibly small and fragile. 2 guards held her arms, though she was not resisting. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and searching. She scanned the assembled lords, her gaze passing over their cold, hostile faces until it found his. For a heartbeat, her expression was one of desperate hope, a plea for him to be the man she knew, not this remote and terrible monarch. He forced himself to meet her gaze without flinching, to let her see nothing in his eyes but the frozen emptiness of the king. He saw the hope in her eyes die, snuffed out like a candle flame. It was the cruelest thing he had ever done. Alara of Oakhaven, he began, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics, rolling like thunder through the cold air. You stand accused of espionage against the Obsidian Crown, of conspiring with our enemies to deliver secrets vital to the security of this kingdom. She stared at him, her mouth slightly agape in disbelief. What? No. That's impossible. It's a mistake. There is no mistake, Cassian said, stepping forward. He held up the forged letter. A letter from your masters, found in your room. He then held up her supply request. A coded message detailing our defenses, written in your own hand. Alara looked from the documents to Cassian's smug face, then back to Valerus. My supply list. That's for my work. It's a list of pigments, and I've never seen that letter before in my life. Her voice, thin and trembling at first, gained a note of outrage. This is absurd. Who is accusing me of this? We have a confession, Cassian continued, his voice slick, from your courier. A man who swore you were his contact. I have no courier, she cried, her eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for a single sympathetic face and finding none. I don't know any of these people. I don't know what you're talking about. She pulled against the guard's grip, taking a stumbling step forward. Her gaze was fixed solely on Valerus, a desperate, final appeal. Your Majesty. Valerus, look at me. Her use of his name, a name no one else in this room dared to utter, sent a ripple of shock through the council. You know me. You've watched me work. You know my only passion is for the past, for the stories in the paper. I am a restorer, not a spy. You must know this is a lie. He wanted to believe her. Every fiber of his being, every memory of their shared silences, screamed at him to believe her. He saw the raw, terrified honesty in her face. But he also saw the evidence on the table. He heard the unified voice of his council. He felt the weight of 2,000 years of duty. To doubt now, to show weakness, would be to unravel everything. He had made his choice. He had to see it through. He steeled himself, letting the ice reform around his heart. The evidence is irrefutable, he said, his voice a blade. Your position gave you access. Your actions gave you cover. Your lies are no longer credible. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She sagged in the guard's grip, all the fight going out of her. Her face crumpled, not in fear, but in a kind of profound, devastating heartbreak. It was not the accusation that broke her. It was his disbelief. You believe them, she whispered, her voice ragged with pain. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of damnation. After everything, you believe them. He did not answer. He could not. He looked away from her, fixing his gaze on a banner depicting a long-forgotten victory. The silence in the throne room was absolute, broken only by her small, ragged breaths. She had looked to him for a lifeline, and he had cut the rope. He raised his hand, a gesture of finality. Alara of Oakhaven, I find you guilty of treason, he pronounced, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. You will be held in the dungeons to await your final sentence. Take her away. The guards tightened their grip on her arms and began to pull her backward. She didn't struggle. She was limp, a doll whose strings had been cut. But as they drew her toward the great doors, she lifted her head one last time and looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes now. There was no fear. There was only a vast, empty expanse of sorrow, and a pity so deep it scalded him. It was the pity of the condemned for her executioner. Then the doors boomed shut, and she was gone. Valerus sat alone on his cold throne, the king victorious, the man utterly destroyed. The dungeons of the obsidian keep were carved from the mountain's heart, a place of damp, chilling silence where time ceased to have meaning. Ilara was thrown into a small, lightless cell. The door, a slab of solid iron, closed with a sound of utter finality, plunging her into absolute darkness. For the first few hours, she was numb, suspended in a state of shock that insulated her from the full horror of her situation. She simply stood in the center of the cell, her body cold, her mind a hollow, echoing chamber. The king's words repeated themselves, over and over. The evidence is irrefutable. Your lies are no longer credible. He believed it. He truly believed it. That was the deepest cut, the wound from which she knew she would never recover. As the hours bled into one another, the numbness receded, replaced by waves of despair. She sank to the floor, the rough, cold stone leaching the last of her warmth. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself as small as possible, as if she could physically shrink away from her own pain. Tears she hadn't been able to shed in the throne room now came, silent and hot, tracing cold paths down her cheeks in the dark. She wept not for her impending death, but for the death of a beautiful, fragile thing that had just begun to grow between her and Valerus. She wept for the man she had seen glimpses of, the lonely, weary soul beneath the crown, and for the fact that he had chosen to bury that man forever. Days passed. Or perhaps it was only one long night. A guard would open a slot in the door to shove through a piece of stale bread and a cup of water, the brief intrusion of faint torchlight the only marker of passing time. She barely ate, barely slept. She existed in a grey twilight of memory and grief. She thought of the library, of the scent of old paper and the feel of a fragile page beneath her fingers. She thought of her work, left unfinished on the table. The corrected river on the map, the half-bound book of poems. Small, incomplete eternities. Meanwhile, in the silent grandeur of the palace above, Valerus was being consumed. He had won. His counsel was placated, the perceived threat was neutralized, his kingdom was secure. But his victory was a mouthful of dust and ashes. The castle felt enormous, empty. The silence that had once been a comfort was now a roaring void, amplifying his solitude. Every shadow seemed to hold her shape. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the echo of her voice. He could not bear to be in the throne room. He retreated to his study, but the forged letter still lay on his desk, a venomous accusation. He found himself, against his will, drawn back to the one place he had been avoiding, the Lyceum. He entered it after midnight, when the keep was still as a tomb. The library was just as she had left it. Her lamp was cold, but her tools were still arranged neatly on her work table. A half-finished map was laid out, the fine lines of her drawing a testament to her skill and patience. The book of poems lay beside it, right where Cassian had left it before taking it as evidence. He walked to the table, his movements slow, heavy. He reached out and touched the back of the chair she used to sit in. It was cold. He picked up one of her brushes, the badger hair still stiff with dried pigment. He remembered watching her hands, so deft and certain, as she worked. "You carry your work on your skin." He had said that. A lifetime ago. His eyes fell on the book of poems. He picked it up. It felt impossibly light in his hand, a fragile, mortal thing. He had allowed Cassian to turn this object, this thing she had called beautiful, into a weapon against her. He opened it, his fingers stiff. He found the page she had shown him. "Your eyes are the summer sky after a storm, clumsy. Honest." He traced the words with his finger, the ink faded but the emotion still palpable across the centuries. Could a person who saw the beauty in this be capable of such cold, calculated treachery? A detail, a tiny, insignificant thing, snagged at his mind. The confession from the captured spy. Cassian had said the trapper was to receive the map hidden inside this very book. Valerus ran his thumb along the book's spine. It was old, the glue brittle. The binding was loose, the threads frayed. It had not been tampered with. There was no hidden compartment, no slit in the leather where a map could have been concealed. It was just a book. A simple, broken old book. It was a small thing. A detail that could be explained away. Perhaps the spy was to have been given the book itself. But it was a dissonant note in Cassian's perfect symphony of proof. A crack in the flawless facade of his case. And through that crack, a sliver of doubt began to shine, as painful and as brilliant as a sunrise after an endless night. He left the book and moved to the map she had been working on, the one she had been so excited to show him. The pass it flows from must be wider than we thought. It was a strategic correction. A valuable piece of intelligence. She had offered it to him freely, eagerly. Why would a spy, whose goal was to weaken his kingdom, voluntarily point out a flaw in their existing knowledge that would ultimately strengthen it? It made no sense. He stood in the center of the silent library, surrounded by the evidence of her true nature, her passion, her meticulous care, her honesty, and felt the foundations of his certainty begin to crumble. He had judged her based on shadows and whispers, on expertly crafted lies presented by a man he trusted. He had not judged the woman he knew. He had looked at her in the throne room and seen a traitor, because that is what he had been told to see. He had refused to see the person who stood before him, begging him, with her eyes, to remember. The horror of what he might have done began to dawn on him, a slow, cold dread that was far more terrifying than any army at his borders. He had not just condemned a spy. He had betrayed a soul. The doubt, once it took root, became a consuming fire. Valerus locked himself in his study, the full force of his formidable intellect, once used for strategy and statecraft, now turned inward, focused on deconstructing the case against Ilara. He told his court he was deliberating her final sentence, a lie that bought him precious time. He bypassed Cassian entirely, using his own personal guard, vampires bound to him by blood oaths of absolute loyalty, to conduct his own shadow investigation. He had to know the truth, even if it destroyed him. He started with the first letter, the one with the hawk sigil. He had his agents retrieve samples of Baron Valeric's official correspondence from their own intelligence archives. He spent an entire night comparing them under a powerful magnifying lens. The ink was similar, yes, both oak gall. But the composition was slightly different. Valeric's ink had a higher iron content, giving it a darker, almost black finish as it aged. The ink in the forged letter was browner, with trace elements of wine, a common additive used by scribes to alter the hue. A specific scribe. Cassian's personal scribe, a man known for his vanity and his custom-mixed inks. It was a small discrepancy, one only a paranoid, obsessed mind would find. Next, the confession. He sent his most trusted agent, a silent, lethal vampire named Lucian, to the human borderlands. Not to find spies, but to find fur trappers. Lucian returned 2 days later with news. The trapper Cassian had captured was a man named Thomas. He was not a wanderer. He was well known in the local villages. And he had a rival, another trapper who had coveted his territory for years. This rival had recently come into a great deal of money and disappeared. Most chillingly, Thomas's family had been threatened. His wife and child would be harmed if he did not cooperate with the Lord in silver who held him. Cassian. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture not of Ilara's guilt, but of Cassian's monstrous, meticulous deception. The final piece was the coded supply request. Valerus summoned the quartermaster, a grizzled old vampire who oversaw all the keep's logistics. He showed him the request. This order, Valerus said, his voice dangerously calm. Did Ilara deliver it to you herself? The quartermaster squinted at the parchment. No, your majesty. Lord Cassian brought it to me. Said he was saving the girl a trip. Seemed a kindness at the time. It was the final nail. Cassian had intercepted her real list and substituted his own forgery. Ilara had never even touched the treasonous document. The entire case, every piece of irrefutable proof, was a lie. A web spun by Cassian to ensnare not just Ilara, but the king himself. He had used Valerus's own diligence, his ingrained paranoia, his sense of duty, as a weapon against him. He had made the king his puppet. The realization did not come with a roar of fury. It came with a sickening, hollow calm. A clarity so absolute it felt like the world had stopped turning. He saw it all: Cassion's jealousy, his fear of change, his ambition. He saw the scene in the throne room, but now he saw it from her perspective. He saw her terrified, bewildered face. He heard her voice, begging him to believe her. "You believe them." Her heartbroken whisper echoed in the silent room, a final, damning judgment on him. He had failed her. In the most profound and catastrophic way a person could fail another. He had demanded her trust, taken her tentative gestures of connection, and repaid them with condemnation based on the word of a snake. The weight of his failure was crushing, a physical pressure in his chest. There was no time for regret. Not yet. He had to fix it. He had to go to her. He had to release her, to get on his knees if he had to, and beg her for a forgiveness he did not deserve. He burst from his study, his movement a blur of black silk. Guards and courtiers flattened themselves against the walls as he swept past, his face a mask of cold, terrifying urgency they had not seen in centuries. He did not run, but he moved with a speed that devoured the long corridors. He descended the winding stone steps to the dungeons, taking them 3 at a time. The air grew colder, damper. The torchlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. "Open this door," he commanded the 2 guards outside her cell, his voice cracking like a whip. They scrambled to obey, fumbling with the heavy iron key. As the lock groaned and the massive door swung inward, Valerus's senses, 1,000 times sharper than a mortal's, were assaulted by a scent that stopped his heart. It was the smell of blood, fresh and cloying. And something else. Nightshade. A poison. He shoved the door open and stepped inside. The cell was almost completely dark. A single, weak shaft of light from the corridor fell upon a small shape huddled on the floor. It was Ilara. She was lying on her side, curled in on herself. A dark stain was spreading across the stone floor beneath her, and a small, empty vial lay near her hand. "No," he breathed, the word a strangled sound. He rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. He gathered her into his arms. She was limp, her body frighteningly cold, even to him. Her head lolled back against his arm. Her face was ashen, her lips blue. A trickle of blood stained the corner of her mouth. Her eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, unfocused, but they found his. "Valerus," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "I'm here," he choked out, pulling her closer, as if his own unnatural vitality could somehow hold her here. "Ilara, I'm so sorry. It was a lie. All of it. I know now." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Too late," she murmured, her breath catching. "He came. Cassian said the king's justice was too slow. A mercy, he called it. The poison had been forced on her, the scene staged to look like a suicide born of guilt. A final, perfect twist of the knife from Cassian, to seal his victory and erase the evidence of his crime. "Stay with me," Valerus begged, his voice breaking. He pressed his forehead to hers, the ancient, immortal king reduced to a desperate, pleading man. "Please. Don't leave me." He could feel her life slipping away, a fragile warmth fading into the final cold. It was the most profound agony he had ever known, a pain that dwarfed the wounds of any battle. Her eyes, for a moment, seemed to clear. She looked at him, and in their depths, he saw not pity or accusation, but a flicker of the same connection he had felt in the library. She saw the man, not the king. She understood. "The poem," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The summer sky after a storm. It was you." Her hand, which had been resting on his chest, fell away. Her last breath was a soft, final sigh that fogged the cold air for a moment and then was gone. Her eyes, which had held such life and passion, stared blankly into the darkness. She was gone. Valerus held her lifeless body in the suffocating silence of the cell, the full, crushing weight of his failure descending upon him. He had been given a gift, a brief, shining glimpse of light in his endless night, and he had allowed it to be extinguished. He had not just lost her, He had been the instrument of her destruction. A raw, soundless scream of pure agony tore through him, a grief so immense it threatened to shatter his very being. He knelt there for an eternity, the king of shadows, holding the corpse of the only light he had found in 1,000 years. The truth had arrived, as it always does. But it had arrived too late.